Hello students, this is Mrs. Lee with your vocabulary for the personal reflective narrative, An Open Heart. The first word that we will examine is the word devastating. Devastating, in this situation, I have a visual of a dilapidated home during the Great Depression, where many American families lived in what was called Hoovervilles, referring to the President Herbert Hoover, where many Americans lost all their belongings and had to live in villages together in these dilapidated homes. So these were terrible conditions, brutal. So devastating and brutal will work together. What stands out to me is this happened to so many Americans, and we think of America as a very well-developed country. And this was overwhelming and shocking to the rest of the world to see America in this state. This is another visual of children living in Hoovervilles, and of course they're collecting money. And they have a sign that says hard times are still hoovering over us. And again, devastating, shocking, overwhelming. It was an overwhelming time for people. And these children were experiencing having to worry about where they were going to get their next meal, and also having to help the family as well. And again, we're going to see brutal could be used together with the word devastating. And in this case, devastating is telling us what kind of conditions these children live, or what kind of state America. So any word that answers what kind or how many is an adjective. Adjective. With this visual, again, we can see Hoover. We're in Hoovervilles. Again, and you can see a father working, or a man working on the home. And you can see all he has: rocks to keep the tarp that is serving as a roof down. So it is brutal conditions and devastating conditions. I don't know that I necessarily say that these words are synonymous or synonyms. They are very similar, and they both do tell us what kind, so they are both adjectives. So in some cases, yes, you can use them interchangeably. Brutal, you can think about brutal, can talk about the temperatures, the weather, which is, again, going to be terrible and awful and horrific. So brutal and devastating do relate and aren't necessarily always interchangeable, but do have similar meanings. Keeping with the Great Depression type theme, again with the word brutal, we have the dust cloud from the Dust Bowl, where there were quite a few, horrible, and not just a few, but many dust storms that occurred in the Midwest, and they were brutal. Those dust storms terrorized homes, killed many people, destroyed property that could never be replaced. You have to keep in mind, these people don't have insurance. Insurance didn't exist at that point. So when your home was devastated by these brutal conditions of the Dust Bowl, then you lost everything, and you had to start over from scratch. So again, brutal tells you what kind. It serves as an adjective. One brutal notion or idea that occurred during the Great Depression, and many times the men would leave homes to try to find jobs, and eventually, in some cases, they didn't come back. So the women were left to care for the children by themselves, and again, extremely brutal conditions. So not only did we have families suffering, but the brutal conditions tore families apart, so it made it even more horrific, more terrible, more awful, and again, much more brutal than you can imagine, because it did rip families apart. With brutal, describing what kind of conditions, one would describe brutal, or if we're talking about the parts of speech, one would say that brutal is telling us what kind. So therefore, we know that the part of speech, brutal, would serve as an adjective, because it's telling you, the word brutal is telling you what kind of conditions, brutal conditions. When the men would leave home during the Great Depression and they would try to find jobs, they would be considered hobos. And sometimes we say this jokingly, but obviously they were homeless. They were on the road looking for a job, looking for a way to earn one's keep. But once these homeless men, or these wanderers, if you will, once they wandered from place to place, what they found out is that everywhere they went in this country, it seemed to be that everyone was experiencing the same conditions. California didn't seem to experience as bad or brutal and devastating conditions as the rest of the country, so most of these wanderers fled to California. But once they arrived in California, there were tons of laborers seeking the same jobs they were seeking. So in some cases, they went out west and then they returned back home. And they were isolated. And of course, we've worked with the word isolated recently. They were isolated and excluded. They were exiled from the communities they would go through, because these communities, and look, that's a billboard sign. If you will look, very similar to billboard signs we see today. Jobless men, keep going. We can't take care of our own. So we're isolating you. We're excluding you. We're not saying welcome, come, we will take you in and move you on your way. They're basically saying keep moving, because we have nothing to offer. Many of the homeless men during the Great Depression, when they would go seek out jobs to try to come back and send money to their family, again, representing that notion or that idea of being isolated and excluded. But many of these men would walk the railroads so that they could jump on a train and try to travel on the rails and get a ride without having to pay. So that was not uncommon. And not only that, once you found a track of railroad tracks, then the homeless men, or the wanderers, if you will, they knew that, okay, these tracks are leading somewhere, so this is a good route for me to take. So that's one reason they chose to walk the railroads. One, so that they could hop a train and get transportation for free, but also it was somewhat a map. If they didn't have a map, they knew this railroad was leading somewhere. And not only that, if it was a railroad, it was connecting to pretty much a major city, which could most likely and possibly lead to a job. And again, you can see he's walking alone. This was a very solitary type idea of going out on your own. Lots of times you didn't see people moving in packs, because you didn't know who you could trust and who you couldn't trust during these times. And it was right after the frivolous times of the 1920s where everyone trusted everyone. So it shifted to a whole new idea. And when we talk about these individuals being isolated and excluded, those two words can serve as verbs in sentences. So these are great words to use as verbs or action, and they do represent action. This visual is not a visual from the Great Depression, but we have the word bleak. Bleak, of course, cloudy, overcast. I think of bleak and I think of the word dreary, and of course, these bleak clouds. However, bleak could talk about something else. The conditions could be bleak. We could have a bleak outlook on our future. Okay? So again, bleak is telling us what kind. So it's an adjective. And again, pairs nicely. I guess I shouldn't say nicely, but does pair well with the Great Depression theme we have going with this video. The next word we have is frivolous. Frivolous ends in the suffix O-U-S. So that's a clue that lets us know that frivolous serves as an adjective. And I had mentioned earlier that in the decade before, during the 1920s, the decade before the Great Depression, or I guess I should say the beginning of the Great Depression starts in the late 1920s actually. So in the 20s, we as Americans lived a very frivolous lifestyle, not taking into consideration what type of money we were spending. We trusted everyone. There was too much trust. Advertising and credit became a big, huge part of our lives where it had not been in our lives before. So it was the first time we're experiencing this wave of commercials and print advertising. So it did sway the way we spend money. And of course, we see this lady where she's shopping, spending money on clothing she probably really doesn't need. And so when you're shopping in that manner, it could be considered frivolous, and that's spending without thinking or without taking into consideration maybe someone else or even your needs. You have probably heard the word gullible before, and that is trusting, maybe a little bit too trusting, over trusting, too trustful. And in this case, we have the suffix added to gullible, the suffix ity, which indicates to us that gullibility is going to be the existence or the condition of being gullible. You're like, okay, what does that mean? It means gullibility is going to serve as a noun in this situation. Okay, so you can see the gullibility of the fish because that bright green dollar bill is luring him. And of course, we see what's on the end of it, a hook. But yet, what's luring him and playing on his gullible traits is that flashy bit of money there that's luring him. So you see him dressed going to work, but if he sees he can make an easy buck, and that's sometimes we think that if it comes too easily for us, it's generally not true. If we have to work for it, then it usually is true. And so this shows his gullible notion. He is going to work, but he's like, ooh, if I can grab that quick buck, then I wouldn't have to work. And again, if it's too good to be true, then it probably isn't true. And if we buy into that, then we are behaving gullible or behaving in a gullible manner, which is an adjective. But when we add the suffix ity, then gullible becomes gullibility and becomes a noun, which is the condition of being way too over-trusting. You may watch this video as many times as you need in preparation for the vocabulary quiz.